Right, good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Gary Dixon. I'm the chair of the governing body here at the University of Leicester. Also very proud to say, actually, I am an alumnus of the university. I studied here in the 80s, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to Brookfield in our School of Business. One piece of housekeeping: if the fire alarm goes off, get out. It's not a test. Brookfield is a special site. So some of you may have been here before, will know a bit about the history. Those of you that don't, just say that we've owned the site for about 10 years, but for the last 3 or 4, we've been spending many, many millions of pounds developing it. It's now the home of our School of Business, and we've made sure that it's a state-of-the-art facility for our students, and we're very proud to invite you here and to let you see it. In actual fact, this building was owned by, well, not this building, this is the brand new bit, but the main house was owned by a gentleman called Thomas Fielding Johnson. And 100 years ago, he essentially was one of the main movers behind creating the University of Leicester. He was a successful entrepreneur and businessman. He lived in a magnificent Victorian house, and he donated the 37 acres on the main campus to the university and was a principal funder to start off the raising of the money to create the University of Leicester. It's fantastic for us to keep his legacy alive. So obviously we have the Fielding Johnson building on main campus. That's named in perpetuity for him. But this is the modern era of that, and I think if he was to see us here now today, he'd be very proud and he'd be astounded, because some of you may also know that this is our centenary year. 100 years ago, we opened the doors, we had 11 students and 3 members of staff. Today, we have close to 18,000 students and 3,500 members of staff. Substantially different. With this being our centenary year, we have a number of events that are ongoing. You'll be aware, I think, that the Difficult Conversations series is just one of those events. This is the 3rd one. Universities exist to receive wisdom and to grow it, to research and to teach the next generation. We're very proud of the graduates that we produce and of the research that we undertake. And I'm proud, as an alumnus and as a chair of council, to say that we have impact locally. We're a civic university. We're here to help people nearby. But we have impact on a national and international basis as well. It's a great pleasure of mine to welcome you here and to share that story with you. The subject matter for tonight was actually chosen some time ago. It was chosen before we had a war criminal called Putin killing people and bringing the risk of nuclear warfare back to the forefront. I said I graduated in the 80s. That was in the middle of the Cold War. I had hoped we'd moved on from that. Sadly, we haven't, but this is very, very topical, and it's very, very important that we introduce you to the topic. To do that, I'm joined by an esteemed panel, experts in a large number of areas, who I shall now introduce. Bear with me while I take my glasses off, so I now can't see you, but I can read this. So I'm joined by Matthew Bolton. Matthew is a Leicester lad. He grew up just around the corner, but he did escape, went to the United States, and is an academic at Pace University in New York. Matthew is a political scientist and an expert on the United Nations and global peace and security policy, focusing on disarmament. He was a representative of the International Peace Research Association to the United Nations in New York. He was part of the UN advocacy of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which received the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. Andrew Futter. Andrew is a University of Leicester expert on contemporary nuclear weapons issues, in particular looking at emerging technologies and their impact on nuclear strategy and arms control. His research has been influential in raising international awareness of new nuclear threats and encouraging governments to modernize thinking and decisions around this. He's also leading the ERC-funded project towards a 3rd nuclear age, strategic conventional weapons, and the next revolution in the global nuclear order. Cameron Hunter. Cameron is also a University of Leicester specialist in the intersection of technology and security, with a particular focus on nuclear weapons and outer space. and how the politics of space technology intersect with nuclear weapons. Is also part of Andrew's project. When I read this through, I made a mental note to say it's actually not outer space, it has to be inner space, because I studied astrophysics when I was here, but we'll let that one go. Marion Messmer, nuclear policy analyst and co-director of BASIC, which is a London-based independent think tank which focuses on nuclear disarmament. Marion leads on BASIC's risk reduction program, the gender and nuclear weapons program, and has a further expertise in NATO-Russian relationships. She's pretty busy at the moment. And last but not least, Olamide Samuel, University of Leicester Research Associate in Nuclear Politics and Arms Control, was a coordinator of the Scrap Weapons Programme from 2019 to 2021. This project works with international organisations and government to promote the goal of a general and complete disarmament. That is also part of Andrew's project. So that's me introducing each of you. I've got a potted history. Would any of you like to say a little bit more about your research very quickly if I come down this way?
Sure, yeah. So most importantly, I'll add that I recently submitted a PhD which was looking at why trust building between Russia and NATO failed after the end of the Cold War. And the war in Ukraine is a pretty unfortunate extension of that history. So I can talk a bit more about that when we go through the Q&A. And we also have a project on reducing nuclear risks in Europe at BASIC, which is funded by the Dutch government, which was pretty spectacularly derailed by the war in Ukraine as well. So I can bring some of our experiences there into the questions, but also if there are any particular audience interests in that project, then I can also say a bit more about that at a later point.
Great, thank you. Ola?
Yes, so I'm Olamide Samuel, you can call me Ola for short. I used to be the coordinator of Scrap Weapons at SOAS University of London. And Scrap Weapons was a disarmament project that tried to bring in ideas from the 1960s about general and complete disarmament into the 2020s, trying to look at how conventional weaponry interacts with nuclear weaponry and how this actually increases nuclear risk. So we were trying to get this to the United Nations, to the African Union, and we actually had a big group of young volunteers who were very active in actually pushing our goals in these different organizations. And then I joined the third nuclear age, where we could be politically independent and analytically correct.
Excellent, thank you. Cameron?
So the reason I ended up doing a PhD on conflict and cooperation in outer space was because when I said that I wanted to do a PhD on nuclear weapons, I was told that it was a dinosaur issue that was going nowhere and that I should look at something more modern. And in the last year and a half, working with Drew, Ola, and my other colleagues, I've been focusing more on how nuclear weapons are interacting with the politics of East Asia, particularly South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China. I'm also interested in the pop cultural representation of nuclear weapons. I've published a short piece on how they're represented in a video game series that some of you may be familiar with. And I'm also working on analyzing how nuclear weapons are represented in popular board games as well.
Excellent, thank you. Andrew?
Thanks very much. In addition to working with these two wonderful people on this panel and several others in the audience, I'm leading a project which is entitled Towards a Third Nuclear Age. And the idea behind this is that we are at a crossroads in the nuclear order. The technological, political, normative changes are challenging the things we think we know about nuclear weapons, and that we need new thinking, we may need new directions to keep ourselves safe. And this is, I suppose, the culmination of over a decade of thinking about the intersection of military technology and security and technology with a particular focus on nuclear weapons.
Hi everyone, I'm Matthew Bolton. It's funny to be in this building. My friend Michael, who's in the audience, reminded me that we used to hop the fence and play hockey in the parking lot back there. So this is funny to be in the building in a very different role. Yes, it's great to be here. I came to nuclear weapons through a kind of roundabout route. After university, I worked as an aid worker in several conflict-affected places, including Bosnia and Iraq. And in the experience of being in communities that were affected by landmines, I began to understand the impact that the landmine ban treaty had on those communities in both stigmatizing a weapon that had been seen as very normal, just a few years before I was in those places, but also marshalling a lot of resources for demining and mine victim assistance. So when I finally ended up at PACE and in New York City, I began to be interested in the way that such processes also are relevant to nuclear weapons, and was part of the ICANN team that pushed states to negotiate a treaty that's similar to the landmine ban on nuclear weapons. And I was on the team that worked to get victim assistance and environmental remediation into that treaty. So I've been interested in these issues and studying the humanitarian and environmental impact of weapons on communities that are most affected by them, from landmines to nuclear weapons and other things in between too.
Excellent, thank you. So thank you all for coming and sharing your expertise with us. So let's start off by setting the scene. Why are we discussing this now? I mentioned that I graduated in 1987. I'm told that around about that time there were something like 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world, and we've made some progress, and we're under 13,000 now. But is that progress? Why are we still discussing it? Anybody? Just go ahead.
Cool. I'll start, and I'll let people jump in. It is undoubtedly progress. So there are far less nuclear weapons in the world than there were 30 years ago, at the height of the Cold War. But what we found, and Ukraine has really emphasized this, is that nuclear weapons are back, whether we like it or not. They are back in politics. They are back as a major threat that we need to be aware of. And actually, I think this is something that can go back a bit further than the last 6 or 7 weeks. It's actually something that can be traced back over the last maybe decade and a half, something like that. We've seen nuclear weapons become increasingly important for certain states. We've seen increased amounts of money in modernization. So while total numbers have come down, systems have got better or been modernized. So actually, in a sense, that it's while there are less, it doesn't necessarily mean we're in a much better place. And at the same time, we've had pushes from both within but also outside, as Matthew will probably say, to rethink about this idea of nuclear disarmament, about how we get rid, or at least how we manage and mitigate the worst threats that nuclear weapons pose. So I think we are at a point today where public engagement, thinking about these weapons, is absolutely essential.
Thank you. Anybody else like to contribute to that?
I suppose in addition, we can also say that actually some of the breakthrough arms control or disarmament initiatives that we saw and that made people really hopeful, especially towards the end of the Cold War and in the 90s, have completely stalled, in some cases fallen apart, or been rolled back in other ways. So Andrew already mentioned modernization. Some states like China have also been investing a lot in their nuclear arsenals and actually building up their nuclear arsenals. So while for a while, we could say that there was a positive trend when it came to nuclear disarmament. In recent years, that no longer really holds. And what we've actually seen instead is much more aggressive posturing, is really concerning rhetoric, especially from the US and Russia, about whether a nuclear war could actually be won. And then at the same time, we've also seen this modernization and this investment in nuclear weapons. So if you couple that with states that have sort of forgotten a lot about arms control and disarmament, and also lost a lot of knowledge about the dangers of nuclear escalation as well, because throughout the Cold War, this was on all civil servants' minds, whereas, we then went through a period where actually this was a lot less important for people, then you have a combination that makes people like us quite nervous, because it's much less in the public mind, people pay much less attention to it, but actually the risks have remained just as high, if not actually slightly increased.
Thank you. So the fundamental question for me then, do we need nuclear weapons? Isn't it a failing of society that we have weapons capable of killing millions of people?
I mean, I would say we don't need them. I think that they... I think that they have been placed for a variety of different reasons in this kind of magical category as something special and different, and that people impute upon nuclear weapons a lot of understandably, a lot of fears, a lot of sense of like that they are special weapons that do special things. But over the last, I think 8 years or so of conferences on humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, we've seen that they're just very inhumane, indiscriminate, bad technologies that are very difficult to control, have a tendency to go wrong, have a horrifying history of accidents and close calls that has largely been classified, so we don't know much about it, have wreaked havoc on all of our lives. All of us will, are somewhat affected by the existence of fallout. Some communities far more than others, and the idea that somehow nuclear weapons kept the peace, it depends on your point of view. If you were, living on Bikini Atoll, it was not an experience of peace that you had during the Cold War, and so I think we have imputed to them the sense that nuclear weapons are political weapons outside of something, any other kind of weapon that we would just hold to different standards. We hold chemical weapons and biological weapons to a standard of discrimination, that they are indiscriminate, we don't accept them, but nuclear weapons have been kind of kept out of that framing for a long time. And that we're seeing some shift in that for most states, not the ones that have them, but for most states in the international system are kind of fed up and want things to change.
Thanks, Matthew. Given that we've got them, would anyone like to put forward an argument about why they do have a use?
And I think if you think about the word "we" in the question, it depends on which group of people we're talking about. So Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea, has a nuclear arsenal at his disposal and threatens to use it under sort of various circumstances in which the US and its allies might intervene in a war between North and South Korea, including the ability to put nuclear warheads on cities in the west of the US. And in a situation like that, for somebody like Kim Jong-un, his life personally would be on the line. If we cast our minds back to how Gaddafi's regime ended in Libya, it ended extremely badly for Gaddafi personally. And so, perhaps Kim Jong-un is looking at situations like that and seeing what happens when regimes unravel. And nuclear weapons, potentially, from his perspective, might look like a useful way to stop the US from intervening in a situation like that. So I think it's, what Matthew has outlined is the case for the vast majority of states don't see any purpose for nuclear weapons and don't possess them. But there is this minority of states and governments and even sort of individuals and regimes that do profess some kind of idea that these things are essential to survival, either of the state or possibly even of individual leaders.
Okay, so that's a very interesting point, because we do always frame the existence of nuclear weapons by talking about Russia and America and Europe, but you referenced there North Korea. There are other states that have nuclear capabilities, such as India and Pakistan. Are there any other emerging ones that we're particularly worried about? I know we keep thinking that Iran are very close to that. Are there any others that are emerging that we should be concerned about?
I could just jump in here to add my bit. So going off of Cameron's answer about the utilization or the use of nuclear weapons, we have to remember that the international system, which we've jointly developed as a species, is one that prioritizes aggression, military superiority. And we don't necessarily see security in terms of the individual, in terms of human security, but we just sort of interpret this as who has the biggest guns and missiles and whatnot. And so, nuclear weapons are essentially just a symptom of this underlying problem, where we think that the biggest, baddest countries should be the ones with the biggest, baddest weapons. Now, segueing into your follow-up question, in terms of emerging states that, we should be particularly worried about, I think we should be worried about all states that have nuclear weapons, precisely because, especially in the nuclear policy field, we have this artificial distribution of rationality, when we apply rationality to different state actors. And we assume that, nuclear weapons in the hands of the UK government are somehow less dangerous than those in the hands of, South Africa during apartheid. But the fact is that, rationality is a construct, and the rationality behind nuclear deterrence as a theory is something that evolved in the West. And so, it's not necessarily that there is a lack of rationality in some emerging states or non-Western states, but that we don't necessarily understand or listen to the security concerns of these states that have come to rely on nuclear weapons or seek nuclear weapons for their security. So in short, I think we should be concerned about all states that have nuclear weapons, emerging or established.
Okay. So they're here, we're living with them, we'd rather not have them, but we do have them. So what are the effects on society of having these weapons, and who's affected by it? Who'll be having the sleepless nights? Apart from me.
Well, I think Matthew already suggested that we're all affected by them in some way, and I think that's true. That's true on several different levels. So if you live in a state with nuclear weapons, then your government is, of course, investing a huge amount of money in the maintenance and sort of protection of that arsenal, especially if you combine that with modernization efforts. If you live in an area in which nuclear weapons were tested, then there is a good chance that the environment in which you live is still contaminated from these nuclear tests, even if they happened decades ago. And that means that there might still be health impacts on you and your family. And if you are a neighboring state of a state with nuclear weapons, then you always have to live with the potential danger that in a nuclear attack on that state, you are at risk too. So especially given the global implications that a nuclear war would have, in some way or another, nuclear weapons affect everyone globally, not equally, and not everyone's needs have been surfaced in the same way in that regard. And especially survivors of testing have had a really hard time making their voices heard globally. But I think as long as nuclear weapons exist and are in states' arsenals, then everyone is going to be affected by them in some way, whether that's conscious or not.
Yeah. So there's this sense that nuclear weapons have not been used since 1945, and in a legal sense, that's technically true. But in the sense of how we use language normally, there were around 2,000 nuclear test detonations over the course of, up until 2017 was the last one. And the atmospheric ones were particularly bad. And if you walk across Victoria Park here to the War Memorial, there's a small plaque that commemorates the British nuclear test veterans, of which there were about 25,000 British troops that were deployed to nuclear test sites in Australia, in what is now Kiribati, and in the United States. And they have struggled tremendously against the indifference of the British military establishment that has stonewalled against them, been extremely obtuse about the impacts of what they saw, and they're not alone. Like I traveled to Kiribati in 2018 and talked to people who had lived on the island during the time of the nuclear tests. The British tested 9 nuclear tests on Christmas Island, and were effectively in charge, while the US tested another 20-something. And people there have struggled to get noticed by the British government. They've tried to get the European human rights infrastructure interested, and there's just been it's been very difficult. And the people I interviewed would break down in tears when I talked to them about their experiences. People who remember, for instance, that remember the tests, and that British soldiers would gather them into the main plaza. That's where the tennis courts are, and They gave them no protective equipment. Some people were given sunglasses, but they weren't enough. Some people were given blankets, but they weren't enough. This woman that I was speaking to was 3 at the time and just recalls being terrified. And people were told to hold their children away from to make them look away from the blast. Not everyone did. Some children were blinded as a result of it. And it's been very difficult to get any real sort of serious information. There was a study that the British government funded, the New Zealand government to do, and they, for instance, they went to look at whether this was going to impact the food supply, and they sampled 5 fish. Right? If anyone has done statistics, then you know that won't tell you anything about how this would impact the local population. And so I think what's interesting about that is I think a lot of people in the UK, including myself until relatively recently, don't know where Kiribati is. Might not have even heard the name of it. Couldn't place it on a map, but the impact of our behavior is felt there. And I say our, both on my British and American sides. That is indicative of a broader trend of testing nuclear weapons in indigenous land, colonized territories. That's often where waste is stored, often where the uranium mining was happening. So everyone is affected, and some people are affected more, and the way that is distributed has everything to do with the way that the world is organized in often racist and colonial and gendered ways.
So you mentioned there the use of nuclear weapons in conflict in 1945. So a lot of us will have an image, because it was captured on camera, it is archived, about what happened when bombs were detonated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're 2022 now, we've got a lot more technology, so what does this nuclear threat look like?
I'll jump in on that. So the 2 bombs detonated in August 1945 killed approximately 150 to 200,000 people. They were the size of a car, I think, just about a small car, dropped by bombers at the time. By the standards of what was to come next, these were relatively small devices, between 15 and 20 kilotons. Within 10 years, nuclear weapons started being measured in megatons. So thousands and then millions of times a normal sort of bomb made with TNT. What we've actually seen, strangely enough, is for 20 or 30 years, states built bigger and bigger bombs. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union tested a 50 megaton bomb, which is the largest ever done. It's never used, never deployed, but that's how things got out of hand. But what we've actually seen, to some extent, over the past few years is weapons getting smaller in terms of yields. Smaller is a relative term. Still able to destroy cities, but actually becoming smaller. More accurate. More capable in terms of being able to put more warheads or bombs on a particular missile. So we've actually seen a sort of a qualitative shift, especially for the major nuclear powers, rather than a quantitative one. So we mentioned at the start that there's been a certain level of disarmament or a reduction of nuclear weapons. That's kind of been allowed because those systems have become better at what they're doing. You don't need as many to achieve what you thought you needed before. So while it is a good thing, it's important to recognise that shift for what it is.
So you just say a 15 megaton?
50 megaton, yeah.
And how big would that device be, and how far could it be sent?
So Cameron very nearly brought up a thing called Nuke Map, which some of you guys may be familiar with. It's a historian called Alex Wellerstein in the US has developed this model where you can essentially, it's called Nuke Map if you want to look for it, where you can essentially take a particular device and explode it over the city of your choice. We often do this with the third year students in the politics of nuclear weapons class. They don't always choose Leicester, which is good. But
they choose Loughborough instead.
Which, funnily enough, makes absolutely no difference when you use this. And I would try and measure, see how far away my house is. But a bomb of that size detonated above London would destroy a significant amount of London, which would have impact on the whole of society, given how reliant we are on London, transport links, government, finance, health, all of those things. And that's just one rather large bomb. That wasn't deployed. The largest bombs deployed were sort of 10 to, well, Cameron will tell you this, but 10 to 15 megatons. They are smaller now, but relatively smaller. So the metric that I often work on is maybe a dozen nuclear weapons would destroy the whole of the UK. give or take, as a functioning society. So that puts it in some perspective.
And the range, so we mentioned before that from North Korea we can hit West Coast America, but Russia presumably could hit all of Europe. And okay, quite sobering. So this war in Ukraine then is focused our minds about where we are. Things have escalated very quickly. Can any of you explain what is actually happening? What are the politics behind this? We see the news headlines, but there are lots of other things may be happening that we're not aware of.
Yeah, so the war in Ukraine started on the 24th of February in a military sense, but actually, if you were following the news for pretty much the sort of 6 months leading up to it, you probably heard a lot of increasingly alarming rhetoric coming from Russia. So the parties to the conflict really are Russia and Ukraine, and I really can't overstate enough to what extent Ukraine did nothing to provoke this in any way, shape or form. The conflict is essentially motivated by a very colonial and regressive viewing of Ukrainian statehood. So Putin and various other Russian government officials have been on the record repeatedly questioning Ukraine's right to statehood, questioning Ukrainian culture, it's sort of really interesting if you look at the history of Russia and all of that, because Ukraine and especially Kiev is often seen as sort of like the cradle of Russian civilization, but essentially the Russian government used a range of different pretexts in order to invade. If you speak to Ukrainians, a lot of them will say actually they've been at war since 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea, and this was essentially just an extension of that war. But what was slightly different this time was that the rest of the world, or at least Europe and the United States, reacted much more decisively in support of Ukraine. So some say that this really surprised the Russian government, because previously when they did similar things in Georgia in 2008 or then in Crimea in 2014, there wasn't a huge amount of reaction, which meant that Putin perhaps felt emboldened. So since the end of February, we've now seen a war that essentially continues. The Ukrainian military has evidently been much stronger than Russia would have assumed, and in many ways the Russian military, I think, surprised many of us who have been studying Russia for a long time, because it actually made quite a lot of strategic blunders and was just not as powerful as we would have expected. Now there could be several reasons for that, and I don't really want to speculate. One reason that has been put forward is that essentially Putin keeps being worried about the war extending to include NATO, and that he's holding back capabilities for that reason. And then there are also analysts who say maybe the Russian military is just actually not that good, because the Russian economy has been pretty hamstrung for quite a number of years now. The sort of nuclear dimension comes in because we've seen Russian officials use the threat of nuclear war pretty regularly. Like I can point to pretty much any week in the conflict, and someone will have been on the record in some sort of way saying that if the US or NATO were to be more involved in the war, then Russia might consider using a nuclear weapon, that sort of thing. And you can really see, I can't remember who said it earlier, but someone said that nuclear weapons have been used as a political tool, and you can really see that in that conflict, because they're essentially being used as a huge threat, as a huge red line. Don't get involved or else. And I think that's really scary. That sort of made a lot of people in Europe sit up and look around and realize that the nuclear threat is actually still really prevalent.
So you mentioned there at the beginning about the propaganda machine within Russia trying to claim that there were cultural differences between Russia and Ukraine. I found that quite surprising, because about 10 years ago I visited Russia, Ukraine, Crimean Peninsula, and to my man on the streets perspective, they were very, very similar culturally. Do we know whether the average person in Russia has a genuine appreciation of what's happening and for the real reasons why this conflict's broken out?
So this really depends on the social strata of the person you're talking about and where they are in the country. So ever since Putin started his first term as president back in 1999, he successively became more authoritarian, and that meant that over a number of years, the media in Russia became less independent. So one of the first things that we saw in this war was that any protests that were happening were shut down really quickly, and that any remaining independent media was shut down in some sort of a way. And a lot of organizations that were more independent from the government that could have disseminated political information were also shut down. So what made me quite hopeful early on when I was watching the reaction among Russian citizens to the war was the number of protests and how many people were out in the streets, essentially. However, we've not seen much of that recently, and that's in part due to the criminalization of the protests, and also in part due to the effectiveness of Putin's propaganda machine. So I saw a really interesting report where a journalist, an English journalist who's still in Russia, went to speak to the family of a young man who died in Ukraine, and they sort of looked at how his family was reacting to his death, whether they were angry at the government, whether they thought that the war was unjust, and actually because of the propaganda that Putin has been spreading about this war being about the denazification of Ukraine and essentially being a war against fascism, which is a really important narrative in Russia, this family was acting as if this young man had essentially died in the same way as his grandfather, who died during World War II. So they were buried side by side. They were essentially, treated as anti-fascist war heroes. So I think, if I had to guess, I think unfortunately the great majority of Russians at this point in time are probably inclined to believe what they see on TV because they have no alternative. It's like as if you imagine that all the news that you see all the time is essentially fake or distorted in some way. So that means that it makes it just really difficult to sort of question your reality.
Okay, thank you. So that I guess that increases the importance of nuclear disarmament. So I'm going to ask where we are with that now, and I guess the answer is quite a bit different to what it would have been 6 months ago, but we hopefully might get back on the direction of travel to start about disarmament rather than about gearing up with more armaments. Any updates on where we are with that now?
I think one thing that has significantly changed in the last few years is not just the strategic competition between the big military powers, but that the majority of the world states have sort of gotten fed up with the nuclear order. So in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that was negotiated, I think in 1968, is that right? I'm testing my knowledge here. It included a bargain in which the states that didn't have nuclear weapons agreed not to get them in return for the freedom to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, and that nuclear-armed states would eventually disarm at a timely date, I think it says in the treaty. That, as you can see, one side has largely kept their bargain. The other side hasn't, and they noticed. But I think when we live in nuclear-armed states, we don't know how annoyed those other states are. Because they feel, justly I think, that they have not gotten nuclear weapons, and they don't want them. They see them as dangerous. And so over the course of, from about 2013 to today, there's been a growing kind of diplomatic process that culminated in the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that the majority of the world states have adopted a humanitarian ban on nuclear weapons, modeled after the chemical and biological and landmine and cluster munitions bans. We have about 60 states that have signed and ratified, about 80-something that have signed. And their first meeting of states parties for this treaty is this summer. And we shall see what that does. Now, none of the states that have nuclear weapons or rely on other people's nuclear weapons for security have joined this treaty, and they have made it quite clear, most of them, that they're not going to join. But there are cracks in that network. The Spanish governing party is in a coalition, but the main party promised during the election to actually join the treaty. They haven't so far. But that shows you that there's some shift. In Germany and in the Netherlands, vast majorities in public opinion polls would like those countries that are part of nuclear arrangements with the United States, would like those countries to join the nuclear ban treaty. And so I think we're having a kind of normative shift. I'll let others on the panel who know this far more what's happening on the nuclear arms state side, because that's not really what I know about. But many of the world's countries are fed up, they're tired of this, and they want to see the nuclear age ended. The weapon part, not the power part. They're happy with nuclear medicine, they're happy with the smoke detectors in this room that use radioactive materials, but don't want us weaponizing it.
Andrew, would you like to come in on that?
Well, I was just going to say, I hate to be the person that says this in the room. But Matthew's exactly right. I think we're seeing a split in the global nuclear order. So for many years, the non-nuclear armed states tacitly accepted, if not really kind of supported the states that had nuclear weapons within this. What we're seeing now is that these states are hiving off, and you're almost having two different groups. My feeling as of today, and I think this is something that's been building over at least half a decade, is that we're probably as far away from genuine disarmament by those 9 states as we have been for a long time. Notwithstanding the brilliant work that's being done to shift the normative elements of this, to shift the conversations, to challenge these states. And even in the UK, which many would say is one of the closest to disarming because of various politics, whether it be Scotland, whether it be UK CND, Centre, all the things that are running that, we've seen an extension or an expansion in the stockpile of UK nuclear weapons only a year ago. So I think we're a long way away, and it goes back to some of the things that Ola said about there are, whether you agree with them or not, but there are genuine security-based reasons for why some states want to keep nuclear weapons. North Korea is a good example. Pakistan is a good example. Russia is a good example now. I mean, just look at how important nuclear rhetoric and threats, perhaps not necessarily so much the arsenal, but and also the test of a new exotic missile fairly recently. These are all really important to the Russian psyche, the Russian idea of what it means to be secure and deterring NATO direct intervention in Ukraine. So we are seeing an order where the states that have nuclear weapons are actually almost doubling down on where they are. And in some cases, we're seeing an expansion of states and the numbers of nuclear weapons they have and capability. China is a good example of this. And on the other side, a much bigger group of states that are trying to push back or trying to find different ways to do this. How that resolves, I don't know. But there's a real split that we probably haven't had throughout most of the nuclear age, certainly since the NPT was signed 50-odd years ago.
Thank you.
I'd like to just quickly add on to that. Another factor we should think about is that nuclear disarmament has actually never been a democratic process. Now, the activism for nuclear disarmament relies on democratic processes, relies on groups of people advocating for a particular cause. But when we actually look at the countries that have disarmed, it was either the former Soviet Union states that returned their nuclear warheads back to Russia, or South Africa, which in some ways rapidly disarmed so that the ANC and the Black-led coalition wouldn't have their hands on nuclear weapons. So it hasn't necessarily been a democratic process in history. But what we're seeing in many Western states, especially many NATO member states, is the rise in advocacy, like through the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK, putting pressure on their governments to pursue paths for disarmament, whether this is nuclear reductions or outright reduction. But then coming back to the fact that nuclear disarmament hasn't been democratic, we have to understand that many of these states, the US, the UK, France, routinely claim that their strategic adversaries also have to disarm for them to pursue nuclear disarmament. And it's very hard to see how a movement like the CND might be effective in a country like China or Russia, right? So it's a really tricky process because nuclear disarmament has to be accompanied by perhaps the global spread of democracy.
Thank you. Which brings me on really to my last question, because it's all a bit bleak when we talk about all the horrible things that are happening, but it's also important to remember that, you know, we have agency, we can do things. So, you know, what should we be doing about it, and what can we do as individuals? Yeah.
So I think the fact that we're here today talking about it, and all of you guys are interested in listening about it, it's a good sign, although it's a bad sign because it's back in the news, but it's people being involved, people understanding this. So you mentioned the 1980s and the concern about nuclear war, particularly in the early 1980s, the so-called Second Cold War and all this stuff, which some people in the room may well remember. Well, while it's not a good thing to be worried, it's a good thing to be engaged and trying to understand what's going on in the world. So what I would always say is I'm not trying to advocate any particular pathway, but make sure you understand these issues, make sure you find out as much as you can and educate, really. So the more people can understand this and make their own choices, and whether it's pressuring governments to disarm or whether it's finding other ways to manage this nuclear order that we're going to find it very difficult to shift, it's about being engaged. It's about citizens wanting to find out and learning more, I think.
Agree with that. And I would also say, depending on your age group, depending on your interests, there are a few different things you could join or do if you want to be very involved. So if you're you know, a younger person who's here today, we at BASIC, for example, have what we call our Emerging Voices Network, which is a global network of young people who are either in the last years of their university education or in the first few years of their career, who are interested in having an impact on how nuclear policy is developed around the globe. What's particularly cool about the network is that it's truly global. So we tried really hard to bring in young experts from countries who normally wouldn't necessarily be able to participate in these kind of conversations. So it's all virtual. You don't necessarily have to be in London for it. You can honestly do it from your computer anywhere. And there are a lot of really interesting conversations that go on. There are lots of other organizations that, you know, sort of like aim at different age groups, aim at different demographics. So if that's something you're interested in, there's lots that you could get involved in.
Yeah, I would say that also where you find political deadlock, look for a different forum, right? So in the 80s, one of the things that many people did, or political entities did around the world, was they found it difficult to get through to their national government, so they tried their local governments. And so this city, for instance, declared itself a nuclear weapons-free zone. And that was a thing that people talked about when I was a kid here. It was in the news. It was on the signs when you came in and out of the city. And many cities around the world did that. One of them was New York City, where I live now, which at its height had 200 nuclear warheads in and around the city. Some of them at a site that's a mile from where I live now. It now has, we think, none. For a variety of different reasons, and we're pretty certain about that. We've done some various research into it. The Navy appears to be obeying the local resolution that asked them not to bring nuclear-powered or armed ships into the harbor. And you can see them making choices, like they'll stop outside the harbor, and they'll let in aircraft carriers that are conventionally powered, but not the nuclear-armed ones. So local action can impact things. In New York City, we in December managed to persuade the city council to pass a new resolution strengthening the nuclear weapons-free zone and calling on the government to divest its pension funds, which is the fourth largest public pension system in the United States, and it's been requested to divest its pensions of nuclear weapons producers, which is actually not a lot of money, because many of them are losing money. There's a sense that there's a lot of money in nuclear weapons. There aren't, because you only have 9 customers, right? And a lot of those companies are actually not doing that well, except for the last few months. But over the long period of time, over pension funds in sort of time horizon, they're not doing that well. So you can do that here. You can do that in a university, for instance, and ask where its various monies are invested. You can do that in the city. This is a nuclear weapons-free zone, but you can make it actually do something by doing things like requesting divestment get them to pass a new resolution and find ways to shift the conversation locally.
Thank you. Excellent. Now is the time to open it up for questions from the audience. So we have 2 roving microphones. We'll have one from this side and one from that side. We do need the microphones because we are recording this for playback later. So I'll start with the gentleman here.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm following this with interest. Not a lot of intelligence, but I refer to my second son, who did his dissertation over the road at Leicester on film, and his dissertation was over the interpretation of film from the only country that's launched the atomic bomb, the USA, and the only country that's had the atomic bomb dropped on it, Japan. And if you look through the different religions there, you can actually draw your own conclusions. Where it sat with me was it's talking about 1945, which is the year I was born. I'm 77. Deterrence. Why has there not been another war since if deterrence doesn't work? I believe deterrence has worked for 77 years.
Okay, so why has there not been another world war? You mean
Beg your pardon?
why has there not been another world war? Because obviously there have been a number of...
Why hasn't Israel dropped a bomb on Iran? Why hasn't North Korea dropped a bomb on South Korea? And you can go through the whole lot.
Okay,
I mean,
so
I was in Moscow in the 70s.
Yeah, so the question is why hasn't there been another... Why is the deterrent working or not? So would anyone like to pick that up?
Cameron, do you want-
Yeah, so I mean, that's a fascinating question, and it's a question that kind of tortures academics and policymakers in the field. And there are no easy answers because what you're trying to do is prove a negative. So if you're trying to make the case that nuclear weapons prevented something, then you're kind of looking at like nothing, right? So one way to think about the sort of next step to like kind of trying to answer this question is to say, are there circumstances where we can see in the historical record that a political leader wanted to do something, like invade somewhere, and then chose not to as a result of nuclear weapons? And maybe that makes it sound simpler than it is in practice, because as part of my work, I often go into the archives, and it can be extremely difficult to try and trace. You know, you might imagine like a very sort of rational, clean, discussion between policymakers where they say, well, I'd like to do this, but actually, you know, on reflection, you know, nuclear weapons are going to stop me from doing that. It's actually relatively difficult to trace that. That being said, you know, there's scholarly debate on this, and there's a few examples where it does seem like there were countries that did want to use nuclear weapons, potentially as threats. Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 being one of the main ones. And it does kind of look like from the historical record there that, you know, perhaps, both sides just didn't want any kind of escalation at all. So even then, it's not really clear that kind of one side wanted to attack the other. It's more one side was trying to achieve a policy objective with the risk of further nuclear escalation and then backed away partly because of the risk of nuclear war. But again, you're talking about a kind of specific moment rather than kind of thinking about 77 years of kind of constantly preventing conflict. I think maybe a more specific way to think about it is where are these moments that we can point at in history and then ask specific questions about that. The Cuban Missile Crisis literature is probably a good place to start if you want to start reading that. And there was a great book that was released recently by Sergei Plokhy on that just last year, which I recommend.
I'd say that also there's kind of two angles to this that I think whether nuclear weapons kept the peace really depends on where you were sitting. Like again, the people in Kiribati didn't experience the Cold War as a peaceful time for them, and neither did Angolans or many South Africans or Namibians or people in Nicaragua, Afghanistan. Their experience of the Cold War was a very violent one. And one could say that maybe this kind of nuclear structure and deterrent structure might have driven the violence in those places or made it higher. So I think this kind of narrative is a standpoint one. It depends where you are in the international system. The other part of that is even if you do take it, possibly it does work, right, in certain circumstances. But then the question is, are there other alternatives that would work better, that don't involve, like, you having these nuclear weapons that, the US accidentally dropped one on Spain, and there are bits of Spain that continue to be contaminated with plutonium, that thankfully it didn't go into a nuclear explosion, but there's a nuclear weapon missing off the coast of Greenland. There are numerous cases of people whose land was devastated by this. And so you can ask, like, in a policy sense of cost-benefit analysis, like, is there another way to keep us safer that could do the same thing that doesn't risk like blowing up the whole UK? And I think maybe there is.
Just to jump on that, and then I'll pass to Andrew. Also looking at the function of deterrence, we have to consider that we've only ever understood nuclear deterrence from the point of view of state actors. Since 2006 or so, the UN Security Council has been very worried about the proliferation of nuclear weapons to non-state actors, and they even had a resolution 1540 to that effect. The question isn't only that deterrence kept the peace, or if deterrence kept the peace, but what happens if a nuclear weapon or a dirty bomb is proliferated to a non-state or an undeterrable actor? We're still dealing with significant risk there. That's the first point. And secondly, Cold War history teaches us that, nuclear deterrence was a bilateral relationship between the US and the USSR. But today we have many more, state nuclear actors than we did in the 1980s. And these different actors have their own different strategic cultures, they have their own different interpretation of events. And so they might not necessarily approach deterrence from the same standpoint. And so deterrence isn't as stable if it becomes, so based on perceptory interpretation. I'll just pause there. Hand over to Andrew.
What I was just going to say, and Marion probably better speaking to this in some ways, but you could say that what's happening in Ukraine is a classic example of nuclear deterrence, right? Vladimir Putin makes nuclear threats. I don't know how desperate NATO are to get involved militarily on the ground in Ukraine, but they aren't. And one of the reasons they're not is because of that overhanging fear that this could go nuclear. And that is there. Whether that's the main reason, we don't know, but it is part of it. The other thing I would say is that nuclear weapons don't prevent all types of conflict. So we saw India and Pakistan went to war very soon after both testing nuclear weapons in 1999. Argentina went to war with Britain in the Falklands, 30-odd years ago, pretty much around this time. There are a number of other examples of this happening. And then the third thing I suppose to put in is, even in a world without nuclear weapons, it doesn't necessarily mean this would be a peaceful world, right? So one of the logics of deterrence is that people don't necessarily think this is a nice thing. People don't necessarily think that threatening mass destruction is necessarily a good thing, but there's a perception that it works because it is so horrible. And the fear is, or the fear that some have, is that if you don't have these, then it makes the world safer for conventional conflict, that actually you would have more war. Now, just in the same way as Cameron said about proving deterrence, you can't prove that right or wrong either. But it is the other flip side of this coin. So it is an interesting thing that we can't prove. You have to kind of go with a hunch, and that's essentially where we are with nuclear weapons, I think.
Excellent, thank you. So the gentleman at the back had a question. If we pass the microphone across, is anyone else? So we'll come to the gentleman here with the next microphone as well. So go ahead.
Thank you. May I ask one factual question and one hypothetical question? A factual question is, I travelled through Poland and Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia during Brexit, and the questions that I was asked all the time was not, why is Britain leaving the European Union, is, are Britain going to leave NATO? That was the concern in those countries who feel threatened. So the question is it a absolute hard, fast requirement of Britain to have nuclear weapons, have the nuclear submarines as their membership contributions to NATO? That's the factual question. The hypothetical question is, even if it is, if Britain did decide to nuclear disarm, would they be no longer part of NATO and therefore not contributing towards the security of Ukraine and security of Eastern European countries?
Okay,
so
thank you.
NATO doesn't require the UK to hold nuclear weapons as a requirement of their membership. There are only three members of NATO that have nuclear weapons, which is the UK, France, and the United States. And then all the other NATO members only have conventional militaries. So, I don't know whether the people you spoke to were particularly interested in, UK remaining in NATO because of the UK's nuclear weapons. I would think that they probably were generally interested in the UK's military capabilities because the UK was or is currently one of the strongest supporters of Ukraine militarily. One of the things the UK did even before the war started as a sort of signal to Russia, which is also an example of, non-nuclear deterrence in a sense, was that they were training the Ukrainian Navy and were sort of like had promised a certain number of development opportunities there, military-to-military cooperation. Actually, in comparison to France or the United States, the UK doesn't have a particularly big arsenal. So while NATO is, of course, very happy to have the support of the UK's nuclear weapons, in part because France has a slightly different posture and actually sort of reserves its nuclear weapons just for French national use. In terms of NATO, it's really the United States that's the big nuclear actor. I think, I'm German. I think Germany is a really interesting example in how a state can really change its military posture in a really short amount of time and also really invest in its military. So I think there are a lot of other NATO members who make really valuable contributions in the conventional area. So even if the UK were to decide to disarm at the nuclear level, that doesn't mean that its NATO membership would be threatened or that it would be a less valuable contributor in that regard.
Yeah. I'll just add a couple more quick things. So the UK, as part of UK posture, it formally declares that its nuclear weapons are available to NATO under Article 5. That's a key part of what the UK does. The other key part of that is the United States does not want to be the sole guarantor in terms of nuclear weapons for NATO Europe. And I think it likes having at least one, if not occasionally two, depending on whether France is in or out of the decision-making around it, other nuclear actors in Europe. And so while we don't want to get down the road of the US controlling the UK nuclear arsenal or anything like that, politically, it's very useful for NATO and for the United States, for the UK to remain as part of that, to share the burden. And actually, the burden is shared slightly further than that as well, including in Germany. So there are, we believe, around about 100 so-called tactical nuclear weapons that are deployed at US Air Force bases, mostly in Western Europe. I think it's Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Turkey, and Italy. That can be used under NATO nuclear sharing. So those host states would have the ability to deliver those nuclear weapons in time of war. We don't know, as far as I'm aware, Marion will know more on this than I do, but how it would be released. So actually there is burden sharing across NATO as well. It's not just the UK submarines. There are other ways of trying to do this, irrespective of how redundant those nuclear weapons might be and how they're delivered. There is a kind of a real move to try and make sure NATO as a nuclear alliance it includes everybody. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's right. And, just to add a point on the nuclear sharing arrangement, that was slightly bigger during the Cold War. So Greece was also one of the states that used to have nuclear weapons and now doesn't anymore. And they didn't have nuclear weapons themselves. They had some of the US nuclear weapons stored on their territory. And we can see some of the discussion around how comfortable these various host states are with those nuclear weapons and how much they want to invest in further being host nations around the F-35 debate that was going on pretty intensely in various nations around Europe. From the German perspective, interesting because Germany and France do a lot of defense cooperation, and France was hoping that Germany would buy a certain fighter aircraft from France. However, that wouldn't have been able to then carry and potentially deliver the US nuclear weapons, which is why Germany then in the end decided to invest in F-35 fighter jets. So there are lots of really interesting ways how politically this impacts on various decisions that are made around Europe.
Thanks very much. So the next microphone to the gentleman here, and if we take that other microphone to the chap at the back on the right. Okay.
Nuclear disarmament has not made much progress. It's a difficult subject, but I can see objective reasons why Russia would be very reluctant to get rid of its nuclear weapons when America has its, and vice versa. I don't think the same factors apply all round. There seems to be no objective reason I can see why Britain or France would have independent nuclear weapons. Why do they have them? For glory, for prestige. And they put a vast amount of expenditure into that, but that's all it is, show. They're real weapons, but they serve no real purpose. Does that mean that Britain and France are the easy cases for dropping their nuclear forces?
Okay.
Shall I come in on that just quickly?
Yes,
so I think it's worth differentiating between two countries. So there's very little open debate about nuclear disarmament in France. It's just not really on the agenda. It's nothing like here. It's much more open here in terms of the debate. It's much more open to at least public critique, if not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily get heard by those who make these decisions. It kind of depends what you think about nuclear weapons. There are a certain group of what you might describe as an elite or a nuclear elite within the UK, within Whitehall and the government, who believe that they do have a function to do this. We might disagree, others may disagree. And the point there is being, the UK nuclear story is essentially not wanting to find itself in the position it was at the start of World War II, where it stands alone, it's vulnerable, all of this, wanting to rely or hoping that the United States will come and rescue it, which eventually it did, but not at the time back in 1940. And that inculcated a certain belief that you have to make sure you can secure your security. And one of the ways of trying to do that was through an independent nuclear deterrent, and I use it like that because yes, we build the submarines, yes, we build the warheads, but the missiles come from the US, and both of them are all very closely linked with designs in the United States. But that's kind of the story, that's the thinking behind it. But you are absolutely right that a key part of UK nuclear weapons debate is identity, prestige, greatness, politics, and a whole host of things as well. But I think Britain and France are a little bit different in terms of where that is.
I think another angle to that is that it's about World War II for both France and the UK, but I think there's a colonial history there that both of them really want to be seen as still in charge, or sort of in charge.
Thank you. So we come to the chap at the back, and then move the other microphone down here, please.
Good evening. It's a really terrific presentation and a very invigorating discussion we're having. My name is George Merchant Ballantyne, and I'm self-evidently Scots. And I wanted to ask a question about how it complicates Britain's ownership and potential use of nuclear weapons when it's put up against the issue of Scottish independence. I lived in the 1980s very close to Fastlane and the Holy Loch, where the Trident submarine base was. And in the town that I lived in, it was a very hot topic all the time about the peace camp, about protesters. There were always people lying down in front of the trucks that were delivering supplies to the nuclear base. It didn't make the national news because the national news focused on Greenham Common, for example. But I remember in a town on the west coast of Scotland, Helensburgh, very close to the base, trucks had to go through the town delivering all sorts of things to the base. And on one occasion, a nuclear warhead fell off a truck and rolled down the high street towards a group of school children. Now, of course, it wasn't going to explode. That wasn't going to happen. But it was a really, that was the kind of level in which we engaged with these things. And in the current political circumstances, I think it's assumed that when Scotland becomes independent, the intention is to be rid of nuclear weapons on Scottish soil. That is not quite such an easy thing to assume now. The New Statesman just last week ran its cover article on how the current situation with Putin has really thrown the whole issue of Scottish dependence up into the air, because it's posited very strongly on getting rid of the weapons that are based on the west coast of Scotland. There was so much infrastructure development around there that a completely new railway line was built to avoid that kind of incident happening again, which the public weren't even allowed to see. Just looking at it was actually inviting a criminal prosecution. So that's the question, really. How, in internal UK politics, with the potential breakup of the United Kingdom, is that affected by this issue of nuclear weapons being in Scotland, a country that wants to get rid of them?
Thank you. When I agreed to chair this, I didn't think the breakup of the UK Union was coming in, but the question is very, very apposite. Who'd like to respond to that?
Oh, I think that's you.
Yeah, fantastic point. And the reason I was looking at Olamide is because Olamide talks a lot about nuclear eternity. So I'm going to say very little, and I'm going to try and encourage him to pick up the microphone instead. But there's this idea, an underlying idea in nuclear politics writ large, that they're here forever and things will just keep going on and on broadly as they have before. And I think one of the interesting things about bringing up questions about Scottish independence is that it really conflicts so harshly with this idea that things will broadly stay the same and you'll broadly be able to keep going with the same policies that you had before. So
that's a really good segue to transfer that question to me.
Teamwork.
Yes, absolutely. This is how it's like in the office. As Cameron has highlighted, I think one thing that I noticed in your question was how you put an emphasis on the infrastructure, the costs and the amount of infrastructure, pumped into Scotland to keep Fastlane going. And the fact of the matter is, if Scotland were to be independent, the rest of the UK would have to figure out a way to repatriate, whatever is transferable back to perhaps England or Wales. Don't let anyone see this. But it's not an insurmountable problem. I think the decision first has to be made for independence, and then the details will be worked out. When we look at the decision to leave the EU by the UK, when we look at Brexit, one thing most people don't really pay attention to is how the Brexit agreement is, there's a subtitle there about the European Atomic Community, Euratom, which is essentially a market that underscores the European common market, but this market trades in nuclear fuels and nuclear infrastructure to keep nuclear energy going. Now, the UK decided to leave the EU, and Euratom was renegotiated as well. Tons of infrastructure, tons of investment made in that regard, but that was renegotiated after that decision was made. So, yeah, I'll pause there.
Thank you. You come back in.
So have it, at several events recently when I've spoken to people from the MOD, and I can't say too much about it, but they almost refuse to think about this because it will be such an expensive problem as much as anything else, right? Not just politically, so they just don't want this to happen. So there's an option that Scottish independence, there's some sort of deal worked out, which is going to be difficult given what the SNP have said and made it pretty clear that they want a non-nuclear Scotland. But it's not inconceivable that something is worked out where nuclear weapons stay there or something doesn't happen. There's the option, as Ola says, of moving them. So Milford Haven, Devonport, probably the two obvious ones, and I think that they were two of the bases that were looked at initially when they were first trying to think of where to house the then Polaris systems. And I think Holy Loch and Fastlane was home to some of the US submarines at the time, and it made sort of sense to use that. There's a number of very good reasons, as I'm sure you know, of why that's a good place to have submarines. A third option is that the UK somehow has to rent or use bases of an ally, whether it be France or Kings Bay, Georgia in the United States. That which becomes even more complicated if you do that, and where you put all the other infrastructure, because of course it's not just the submarines, it's the storing the warheads and loading missiles, all the other bits that go on. So my guess is this is one of those things, well, not my guess, my feeling is that this is one of those things the UK government doesn't want to think about because it will be really, really difficult and expensive to move it. And there would be an enormous amount of public scrutiny given how much money it would cost to build the facilities you would need to move that fleet and where it's housed.
Thank you. We're rapidly running out of time for the formal part of the questions. If I can come to the lady at the front. That's right, we'll take two more. One here and then one there. But we can have time afterwards for informal questions, but with a drink in our hand outside. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, thank you for the discussion. What I wanted to ask was, there has been scholarly debate presently that there are cracks on extended, with the belief of different states on extended deterrence because of what's happening in Ukraine and other states that gave up nuclear weapons. So do you see that in the next decade, Also, would there be more, maybe another emerging nuclear weapon state just because of the security concerns? And linked to that is another part where if major states are not experiencing arms control and they're eroding arms control, how do you see them influencing the arms control on regional level, let's say between India and Pakistan, when nuclear industrial complex is involved, the military industrial complex is involved, and India is getting nuclear deals with 13 plus other states, and Pakistan is seen as an ally to China. So in these two blocks, how do you see arms control working regionally?
Okay. Quick response from one of you.
Some really good questions there. So my response to whether we can expect more proliferation to happen, I really hope not. I think, as you pointed out, Ukraine has made a lot of states question their security. The sort of biggest reason why I feel fairly confident to say that we probably won't see further nuclear proliferation is because of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which I think has already been mentioned, and that's the most comprehensive in terms of numbers of states who have signed up to it treaty that exists, that sort of tries to limit nuclear weapons, and it essentially means, I think Matthew mentioned it earlier in the context of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. It means that the states who have signed it have agreed not to develop nuclear weapons. Violating that treaty would be an incredibly big deal. It may not necessarily sound like it, but it really would be. And the only state to ever have signed and then left is North Korea. So that's the only time that happened. So I hope that means that we will continue to see the nuclear possessors being relatively stable. There's, of course, the question of Iran and the success of the sort of negotiations there around the JCPOA. I don't know whether we have an Iran expert on the panel who could speak to that. And then your other question around regional arms control, I think that's going to be one of the big challenges. I think generally, especially with a live crisis going on, it's really hard to see how arms control will develop further. There are also a lot of questions around the influences of other technologies that are outside of nuclear weapons on arms control. And so for that reason, I think none of us know for sure what arms control is going to look like in the future. But the sort of regional arrangements that you mentioned are probably the most likely way that things will go. People also talk about alternatives to traditional arms control, where you look at certain behaviors, where you look at certain exclusion zones rather than just limiting numbers, limiting systems. So there are a number of challenges that we still have to work through. And the only thing I can say for sure is that we need to keep working on the solutions, because otherwise the risks are going to be too high.
Yeah, thank you, Marion. So last final question here, the microphone, and then we'll wrap it up.
I'd like to pick up on the standpoint of most of our own news and information is distorted and prejudiced in the interests of various people who control most of the media. And agree with the gentleman that was speaking about Scotland. A lot of the demonstrations, even big ones that I've been on, have never even been reported, even locally. But also, following on from that, I didn't realise until quite recently that the Ukrainians were in a civil war for 8 years with the two states, I understand, that were rebelling against being part of the Ukrainian state as a whole. That might or might not be false news, but that was reported on the BBC.
So you'd like to know?
No, basically, that combined on both sides with the trend towards Armageddon, with the build-up of pressure and the fundamentalists' ideas of Armageddon sort of coming to the fore with a lot of leaders being of a fundamentalist persuasion, it makes me a bit concerned that we're not, although we're being allowed to have a say, nothing actually gets done.
Okay, thank you. There's quite a lot in there. I'm really interested in this concept of the Civil War and things like that. Would anyone like to?
Yeah, I won't speak about Ukraine because I'm not a Ukraine expert, but I think I'm just thinking about some of the themes across several people's questions. And I think when we talk about nuclear weapons as if they are these mythic things, like we use the term Armageddon, for instance, we forget about the mundane, things falling off trucksness of nuclear weapons, which that sort of thing happens a lot because laptops freeze, printers don't work, technologies don't always work in the way that they're designed. I think a statistic that is kind of a very obvious one, but still alarming, is that the people the troops that control US nuclear weapons use drugs at the same proportion as everyone else, the population as a whole. It's an obvious statistic, right? But because we often talk about nuclear weapons in these kind of grandiose ways, we forget about the fact that they're on trains, they're on. There are people who don't want to think about worst case scenarios, who don't mention the Scottish independence, right? It's very ordinary, while also having fantastically awful possible consequences.
Okay, thanks. I think that's a place where we can actually wrap up the formal proceedings. I was hoping to end on a more positive note, but we've got this Armageddon thought in our minds, which is awful. But thank you very much for coming. Please do stay and join us for some canapes and a drink outside. Our speakers will still be there to have a chat. If you didn't get a chance to ask a question, please come and talk to us. Obviously, don't ask me. I know nothing about it, but they'll be happy to help with that. I mentioned that this is one in a series of the difficult conversations. The next one is on the 7th of July. It's called Every Breath You Take. I believe it's to do with air quality and not the song that was written by the Police in 1978. And so thank you all for coming. And can I, in particular, thank all my speakers for their excellent input and a fantastic evening. Thank you.